All right, Chapter 5, Lecture Notes. Now we're going to talk about summary queries. And this is what pulls our stats from a database, okay? For example, how many customers are in the state of Michigan? What is the average total of all orders for a specific customer? What is the highest customer total for the month of December? These are all questions you can ask the database. And by using select statements, summary select statements, we're able to do that. And it's all done with only five aggregate functions that are available to you. Average, sum, min, which is the minimum, max, which is the maximum, and count. Okay. And I'll explain count as we get down to that. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at some of these right now. Well, I'm going to try to copy this. I might not be able to. So let's say I wanted to see what the average invoice total was for all my invoices. So I could let's go ahead and start a new window, new query window. I don't want to say that. And we'll type that in. Okay. Now we're getting an error because we need to be in the right database. And for us to be in the right database, it's going to be AP. Okay. So let me go to our AP database. And it's right there. Oh, wrong class. My bad. Let's see. There's ours right there. Okay. Now, if I run this, so I get $1,879.74. Okay. What is that? What we just received are all of these invoice totals from invoices. So all the invoices that we have, we've got the invoice total that we're looking at. Okay. I don't know how I keep on putting uppercase in N. So this average is the average of all these invoices throughout there. So you see what SQL Server is doing is it's taking a bunch of data, it's giving us the average and spitting it out. So that's using the aggregate function average. We could do the same thing with sum. Okay. So, and we would just, instead of putting average here, we would put sum. Okay. And we can run all three of these again. So the average is $1,879. I should name this correctly. SUM. Okay. So the sum is $214,000, $214,290.51. Okay. We can also figure out what our max was. Okay, so let's what was our max invoice? Let's type in max Again, we want to name our alias appropriately. And by the way, you do need an alias, otherwise it'll just pick one for you. So this could be our highest, just invoice. Okay. And again, if we run everything, we'll see that our highest was almost 38,000, and we could do our lowest. Okay. And that would, of course, be min, and we could say lowest invoice. All right. So if I run that, we see what our lowest invoice was $6. All right. So I know I can hear somebody asking a question. Can we put this in one query? Well, the answer is yes, we can. So because it's all from the same tables, we can we can uh, we can get rid of this. We can get rid of this. We can get rid of this one up here. And we don't need all those selects. So let's go ahead and get rid of those. Okay. And so I'm going to do comma. I always like to, instead of putting the comma at the end of my query, end of my line, I put it at the beginning so I can easily comment it out. Same thing here. And the same thing here. All right. So now if we run this, it'll only return one line. Okay. So let's see where that takes us in our notes. So these are all different examples that you can use in your aggregate queries. Okay. So I would expect you would look at these and try these out. Okay. All right. But one of the things we haven't done is we haven't talked about count. Okay. Count is unique. It's different than the aggregate ones. Uh, it counts how many rows will be returned. Right? Let's try that one out. So if I do a count, if I just say asterisk, you can tell how many invoices are returned by looking in this bottom right corner, 114. Okay? But this is not utilized anywhere in your query. We could easily do count and have that number returned by our query. Okay? And this time we only return one row and 114 because that's how many rows are in our invoices table. And of course, it's a good practice to name this. And we might count, say, invoice count, okay, or something like that. And then we would know what that column actually is instead of no column name. All right. So let's expand this table. Let's take a look at it a little bit more. So we've been looking at invoices, okay? And right here is that. Now, you can also do a count of any row, okay? Um, for example, I can do a count of invoice ID. Okay. Now, because it's a primary key, we know that it's unique. Okay. Primary keys are unique in a table. So we can only have one and only one invoice ID for each invoice. So if we count that, we know we're going to get exactly the same number is count asterisk. All right. Let's try something that might not be unique because we know that some of our invoices are going to be from the same vendor. Okay. So let's try vendor ID and see what happens. And let's see if we get the same number. And we do. Even though we know that some of the vendor IDs are going to be in there multiple times. If we want to see truly the right number of vendors that we've used, would have to use distinct here. Okay. And if we run that now, it's only going to look at the first instance of the vendor ID. Whoops, I lied to you. You have to put that in there. Okay. Let's try it now. 34. Okay. Because now it's only looking at the first instance of the vendor ID. So that's something you have to consider when when you're using count. If you want the actual number of vendors that have invoices, or do you want every row in the invoices table? Okay. Now, let's just go back to this. And again, we'll see that this is 114. It doesn't care that a vendor ID might be in there more than once. And you can do this for almost every field, okay? Except where the column could have nulls. Now, I recognize that every invoice hasn't been paid yet. And if it hasn't been paid, in this case, it's going to have a null value. And so what happens if we do a count where nulls might be in there? It doesn't count nulls. Okay. So what's the lesson here? If you want exactly the right number of rows in the invoices table, you can either do count asterisk or you could count the primary key. If you want only the distinct or the unique number of vendor IDs or of any column, use distinct within the parentheses. And avoid doing a count on fields, on columns that might have nulls. How do we know that uh, payment date would have nulls? Because it has this comma null value or parameter. All right. Now, invoice due date, we wouldn't have a problem with because it would default it to something. Okay. Or programmatically, it would handle it. All right. So that all of that. Okay. Now, summary queries are used in groups. Okay. The commands I was just using were for the whole table. But sometimes I want to look at things by groups. Like I might want to look at how many invoices each vendor I have ordered from. Okay. So let's take a look at this query right here. Let me see if I can copy it. Yeah, close enough. All right. Let's see what I forgot to copy. Oh, vendor state. Okay. All right. Well, I better spell state right. All right. So let's talk a little bit about this. Okay. I'm going to put the comma over there. I'm going to put the comma. I always like to make my queries look the same as they get more complex. Okay. Um, I always like to put my joins on their own lines. How many people watch the Super Bowl? Good. How many people thought the Super Bowl was dumb? All right, I digress. I was actually preaching last night, so I didn't watch the Super Bowl. I watched the end of it, but that's about it. And at least I didn't watch Bad Bunny. Bad Bunny, you should watch. All right. So if I want to see some aggregate values by state where the vendor is, this is how I would do that. First thing is I would never have column names like that. Okay. I would always put them like this using camel case. Same thing here. I don't like using brackets or quote in my queries. Okay. And same thing here. All right. So if I run this, let's see what happens. And then I'll explain what's going on. Okay. Um, so it's giving me vendor state, the sum of the invoice total, which I called this, the count of the invoice count per state, and the average invoice total per state. Okay? And these are what I'm getting. In fact, if I add these up, I'm pretty sure it would equal 114. Okay? All right. Some things to be noted by here. The group by is a way of grouping your data set. Okay? And it's not an order by, it's a group by. Now, I could put an order by in here, which would probably be appropriate. So, because I would want to order it by vendor state. Okay. Looks like it's already in order by, but anyways, I could easily do this. All right. Here's the rules for a group by. Your group by comes after your from clause. And that includes all your joins. So we've joined two tables together, vendors table and the invoices table. It's an inner join because we know that every invoice has to have a valid vendor. Okay, in our case, because we do have referential integrity in our database. And when we do a group by vendor state, you can include that in your select statement. You cannot include any other column outside of an aggregate. It has to be in your group by, it has to be a group by column. Okay. So for example, let's take a look at our vendors table. It's right here. Let's say I wanted to see the vendor city. Okay. I'm going to put this down here. Okay. If I ran this, what do you think would happen? Even though you don't see any red yet. If I run this, it will blow up. Why? Because vendor city has to be in an aggregate or it has to be part of the group by. So we could do something like this, min vendor city, comma, max vendor city. Okay. And we could then use vendor city. Okay. And this information would tell us what? Look at here. The only thing we know about from this is that we know that there's more than one city in California that we order from. Okay. But we don't know how many. Okay. So if we wanted to know how many, we could do one of two things. Um, we could put vendor city here. Now you probably going to want to order by that as well. Whoop, not there. Right here. And then you probably want to order by it as well. Now, if we try to run this now, what happens? It blows up. Well, it should have blown up. That's not what we want. We want just one column for vendor city. And this will tell us all the cities that we have a vendor for that state. So we could see that California, we really have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. We have 8 cities in California. And by the way, these aggregates are now being done at the city level. Okay? It's being done at the city level. Now, something else we could easily do is we could take this away and we could use our count. Maybe we do just want to know how many cities that we have. Okay. Now this should tell us how many cities we actually have in every state. Not quite, because we have to use distinct. All right. You see how that worked? So, and by the way, we can also look only at the cities that have a vendor city count greater than 1. Anybody want to venture to tell me how to do that? You would think it would work in the where clause, okay? So you might put a where clause right here. Um, let's say where this is greater than 1. But let's try running it and see what happens. It doesn't work. You can't use aggregates in your where clause. And it tells you that you have to use something called a having clause. So we have to put it down here. Okay. And if we comment this out, this should only return cities that have states that have more than 1 city. And there you go. Okay. Now let me tell you how to know what to use where. Well, let me show you one more example. Okay. So if I'm going to go here and look at my vendors. This is an easy way to look at my vendors and see, I can see what cities are involved. Okay. And sometimes I'll just browse through the information, see if there's anything I'm going to be looking for in particular. And I might do something like this. It's good to check your data like this, um, to see what you might be looking for. And I'm going to order this by vendor city. And I'll go ahead and execute it. Okay. Yeah, data is pretty straightforward. Um, I don't see any cities that are in two states. Okay. And that's kind of what I was looking for. All right. All right. So that's how to have distinction. Let's show the differences. Let's say I only want to see states that are in Michigan or California. So I could say where vendor state in, we'll say Michigan, California, Ohio. Okay. I could leave this in here and that's would still work. I'm going to comment it out. And let's go ahead and run this. All right. So that's good. That's good. Um, and trust me, it's not looking at this. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this, you could use the vendor state in your where clause or your having clause. Okay. And why? I'll explain that in a second. But we're going to get the exact same data set returned to us. Okay. All right. So I need to explain the where and the having. All right. The where clause is executed before the aggregates are done. Okay. So when I'm going to look at a bunch of data, the where clause happens first before I can look at that data. It narrows it down in the where clause. The having clause happens after I do my aggregate. That's why it's after the group by. So, so the where clause, and we can use it in all of our select statements, is done prior to a group by statement. The having clause is done after I do my aggregates. Make sense? All right, because it does get confusing. All right. And again, you can look at, you can read through this and figure some of that out. Okay. Um, you can see, you can even do a count of how many invoices each vendor has. We've talked about the distinct. Okay. And again, the distinct, because it, when you use a distinct, it's going to only take the first instance of vendor ID. In this case, the vendor ID is what we call a foreign key. Same thing with invoice date. Okay. So again, I would read through my notes and get an understanding of this. Okay. And we've seen both of these numbers. Okay. Um, Distinct vendor ID is different than vendor count of vendor ID. All right. We talked about the halving clause. Okay. This is another example of the halving clause. You can use it with count. So this would give you all the data that is where more than two of the same rows are being returned. Okay. So if you wanted only unique rows, you could do something like that. In this example, if we could actually, and let me bring this example in and show you the difference. Let me see if I can copy it. Well, let's just remember invoice total. Oh, the average of the invoice total. Okay, so so we got average invoice total. Okay. So let's do two examples with this. All right. So in this case, we want to see only invoice totals that are greater than or equal to 500. Okay. Okay. So if we run this, what's going to happen is it's going to get rid of all the rows before it does the aggregates of where invoice total is not greater than or equal to 500. Okay. And there's a lot of those. But if we put this down here, so let's go ahead and put this down here. This time we're going to change it to halving because halving comes after your group by where it comes before your group by. Now, if I do halving here, it's going to blow up because there's one additional thing that I have to do. Okay. I would have to tell if I wanted to use average right here. Now, this is going to mean something different, and you're going to see a different number of rows returned. Okay? Because this is saying that I want to look at every state where the average invoice total is greater than or equal to 500. Okay? And as we lowered the number, we would get more rows. Well, I should say more or exactly the same number of rows. So we're getting 7 rows. There's 8. Okay. Why? Because this number 132 was added. All right. All right, so you guys can look at these examples. Now, if you want to group by invoice date, you could use it in the halving clause. Remember, the only thing you can have in your halving clause is something that was mentioned in the group by statement or an aggregate. Okay. And we saw that with vendor state. Okay. All right. Roll up. I'm not going to do a whole lot on roll up, but what you need to know about roll up is that it will give us a total. So we'll have one more field if you're only grouping by um, uh, one column. Right. So let's take a look at this. We see we're going to do a select vendor ID, count asterisk, and um, sum of invoice totals. Okay. And then they do a roll up. So let's go ahead and try that with our query. Okay. So we can get rid of the having. Let's remember what our data looked like. Okay. So we get 10 rows. If you use group by with roll up, it's going to give you an additional row. Let's see what that additional row is. Let me get that up there. So it gives you this additional row right here. Notice the vendor state is null. And what it's doing is it's adding all of your aggregates up. So in the vendor city count, there's 20 cities that we're dealing with. The sum of the state of all these would be $214,290.51. The count is 114, and you're familiar with that, but it adds all of these up, and the average is that, and it adds all these up, and it figures out the average for these numbers right here. Okay. So when you use with roll up, it's going to do the aggregate for the whole table at the same time. Okay. And I could certainly write this query like that, you know. And we've done that already. All right. Now, where it gets interesting is when you put something else in here. Okay. Let's say we put vendor state or city. Okay. Now we could put vendor city up here, obviously. And we might as well put it down here too. And if we run this, let's see what we get now. We're going to get more than one extra row. Actually, we're going to get we'll get 3 extra rows. Okay. We'll get a grand total, and then we'll get I should say 3. We're going to get a total for each state. So let's see how that looks. All right. So wherever you see a null, so here's our grand total. We got null, null. But anytime you see a null for vendor city, that's a roll up for that state. Okay. And we have one for Arizona, one for California, one for DC, one for Maine, one for Michigan, and one for Ohio, one for Pennsylvania, one for Tennessee, one for Texas. Okay. If I just wanted to see my roll ups, I could potentially do something like this. Having vendor city is null. Let's see what happens here. And this is our roll up. Well, the grand total is right here, obviously. And then this is a roll up for each state. Okay. Now, we're not going to get crazy with roll ups. We'll probably only do one level, but I want to show you two levels just in case. And you can go through this. Okay. I'm going to tell you, don't worry about the cube. You can take a look at this if you like. Um, the cube is really for um, if you ever got into data warehousing and data analysis, um, that's what cubes are for. You actually develop cubes in those uh, industries of data. So we're not going to talk about it here. There are much more useful tools for that. Um, and Again, I'm not too concerned about this. Don't worry about grouping sets. We won't use that here. Um, the over clause is when you want to display summarized data along with the detailed records that were used in the summary. So, and this is a way to do that. You could do a select, and you can sum over invoice date. You can count over invoice date, and you can average over invoice date. So you can show both sets of data with that. Okay. So, in this case, we are we are going to partition by invoice date. So, how many did data did we use on each specific date? Now, the 12/8, the 12/10, and the 12/13 are pretty good, but look at these. We had three invoices on the 16th of December. So we can show the individual data along with the group by data side by side. And this can be useful for different analysis. For example, right here we're seeing, you know, our percentage. What's the daily average percentage type thing? So we can. This is actually showing that. So our date average for um, for for these three numbers is 67.65. And you could run you can when you return data like that, you could say, hey, am I over the data average or below the data average? So this data can be useful. You can also, do calculations with it. You could say, what was your percentage of, what was $144.70 compared to the average, So there's different things you can do with your results set. So again, I would just take a look at this, okay? And we're not going to do a whole lot with this. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's, again, it's just the idea that this is something in your tool belt. All right. Now, did I put everybody to sleep? How many people are awake? Okay. All right. I know that this stuff can get boring. And I promise you, when we start designing our own bowling alley database in Valerie shopping center database, it'll be more exciting. But we have to learn the boring stuff first, okay? So you got two things, you got joins and you got group buys. And to be honest with you, these are two things that cause mental blocks for me. So that's why I'm taking all this time to hopefully you'll understand it. What's the best way to understand it? To go over this, go over your notes again, okay? And hopefully that will help.